powers of deduction what this thing was all about. I think we may have even tried to ask someone, but again, the lack of German speaking was a real inhibition in that context. And eventually we just passed on and went on our way without really knowing. But again, I said it's strange because I can remember it so vividly. While my memories of the rest of that trip are just muddled by the passage of time, the hay cow, the vodka smoothie, and the revelry of that brief experience are just locked in my mind. And I don't know why, but I wonder if it's because it was something that really felt very real. After a whirlwind of carefully curated tourist experiences, it just felt a little bit closer to reality. Or it felt as though we had just drawn very briefly closer to the real lifeblood of that place than we had being in these more commercial settings. I don't know. But thinking about it makes me think of the folks who watched Jesus enter Jerusalem on that faithful day, which we remember this morning. You know, in the hustle and bustle of the city, and especially the busyness of the Passover festival, everything must already have been abuzz with activity. Both faithful Jews making their preparations and their Roman occupiers flexing their proverbial muscles as a reminder of who was really in charge. And then, right through the city comes this parade, unexpected, unplanned. Not an imperial procession with its majestic steeds and armored warriors, but something much more authentic, almost humorous in its simplicity. A healer from the backwaters of Nazareth riding a donkey. And I just have to wonder about the people who got caught up in that. They weren't there to see Jesus. They hadn't even known who was coming. Many of them, it seems, by Matthew's account, didn't even know who he was. But as they saw him pass, I have to wonder, what made them stop? What moved inside their hearts to tell them this is something which should be honored, which should be remembered, even if we don't know what it is? I wonder, what compelled them to take up branches and lay them on the road? To acknowledge a different kind of power passing before them than the curated displays of violent authority present everywhere else in the city. And really more than all that, I wondered, what happened to them afterward? Where did they go? What did it mean? Did they remember it much later, though the other details of that time had passed away? Did they talk about the time they had seen something really real pass by them? Something holy in a way they couldn't name, but that would stick with them for a long time? I wonder. Now, unlike many of the biblical commentators out there, I actually don't believe that most of these ones who welcomed Jesus were the same who demanded just a few days later that he be crucified. I think that was probably a different set. What makes more sense to me is that those present for this strange parade just went right back to what they were doing. Absorbed into the tangled streets of old Jerusalem like smoke disperses in the air, I would imagine, if I had to bet, that most returned to their journeys and went on, just like I did in the streets of Vienna that day. Which makes me think a little bit about us and how much I think we must have in common with the folks along the road at that first Palm Sunday. We read the Gospels and we tend to think of ourselves as the disciples in the stories about Jesus. But so often I find we are more like the other ancillary characters around in these stories. We live our lives, we make our way, we come to church. And if we're lucky, we have one or two experiences in a lifetime that give us a glimpse of the divine. A handful of times when the curtain is pulled back and we feel as though we are seeing what is really real. It's not all the time for most of us. And though we keep putting down our cloaks in acts of service and liturgy to honor the reality we know we've experienced, it may be that those few moments must sustain us for all time, just a glimpse. In fact, as it becomes clear when you read the story, it's only a few who press on to the further journey with Jesus. Matthew tells us the crowds are present to shout Hosanna, and the crowds are present to listen to Jesus' teaching in the temple, but it's only a handful of followers who really press on with him beyond that. Only 2 women in the end who are dedicated enough to continue all the way through the suffering on the cross and to the tomb. But I think that the news they bring back, and this is something we'll continue to explore as we move into Eastertide, the news they bring back, the rumors that filter through the city about resurrection, about a man brought back to life, those stories resonate with that place inside us that knows what we have seen. And it's faith that lets us thread those things together into a story that sustains us and gives us hope even in dark times. I would say that this has been true throughout the history of our faith, that there are always some. They used to be called prophets, and then they were called mystics. Some who find a pathway into ongoing communion with the sacred. And they come back and tell the rest of us what beauty lies there and what peace and what love, and we hear it. And at times it sounds strange and wondrous, maybe even a little scary. Distinct, certainly, from our own experience. But I think the beauty of being in a tradition together over these many years is that we let their testimony touch parts of us that have a sense we have stumbled upon the divine once or twice when it crossed our path. And we bring those memories to bear on what we read and what we hear, and together we let that wisdom guide us into a life of discipleship. And the thing I want to say to you today is that Holy Week is an invitation to enter more deeply into that conversation. You know, we've been traveling together these past 6 weeks with this theme of seeking. We've had this eye looking with us as we made our way. And the challenge has been to ask some of our big questions during this time, hoping that they lead us down the further road of faith. And as we complete this journey this week, my encouragement to you is to take this time to bring the most significant among those questions, the most important among your wonderings, onto the road with you as you journey with Jesus toward the cross this week. Bring them with you, and as sources of hope, bring the assurances of wise ones among us who have told us that something on this road, though it is a painful one, is the key to life and to hope and to peace and to a vision of love greater than we imagined. The challenge of this practice is to bring whatever questions remain in your heart. Is any of this real? Can I really be beloved? Will I ever be at rest? What do you require? Is everything going to be okay? To take those questions and to bring them on the journey with us through this story. We'd like to skip over this difficult part, but don't do it. Don't miss this opportunity to ask your questions of the one who gives himself up for us. And you may not find answers there, as we've been discovering through this series, but surely you will find revelations that open up the parts of you that have known sacredness, holiness, and grace in a way that prepares those parts of your heart to receive the good news of Easter with new resonance and hope. Now, I should tell you, I have not always thought this way. I used to not be such a big fan of Holy Week. From a progressive theological perspective, I wasn't sure that it was worth it to spend extended time meditating on violence and loss, especially as the idea of substitutionary atonement was waning in importance to my own personal faith. And I still believe that a spiritual practice that is hyper-focused on Jesus' suffering and death can be problematic if it is not brought into balance by an equal enthusiasm for the teaching and healing that were such important parts of his life. But today I think that perhaps they are two sides of the same coin. Jesus preached to his followers a profound compassion for the vulnerable around him and enacted that through ministries of healing and presence. He taught about a commitment to radical hospitality and also to nonviolence. And when the time came for him to be executed, those teachings were magnified by his peaceable response, showing that there is a certain sort of power that comes from giving one's life away in contrast to the kind of power derived from taking someone else's life from them. And given the week we've just been through here, at least in the United States, I would say that is a worthy focus of our meditation. And I say that because I noticed that years ago, toward the beginning of my ministry, whenever there was a mass shooting, particularly of children, I would feel an immense amount of anxiety about the following Sunday. What am I going to say? How am I going to make sense of this for my people? How am I going to make it all make sense? And checking in with myself this week, I noticed I no longer feel that. It's been so many times now that I too have become numb in some way to these tragedies, and I worry about that. I worry about my own heart that no longer feels compelled to solve, theologically at the least, these horrific acts. But I'm wondering if Holy Week and the practices of the Christian tradition can here be an aid. Because if they are anything, the practices of this week are practices about refusing to look away, practices about seeing what is really before us, and finding resonance in some way with the brokenness that exists within us. They are practices of marveling at a God who does not orchestrate such tragedies, but who in fact is present within them, suffering along with us, to demonstrate that justice and love are God's ultimate intentions for us. All this reminds me of Denise Levertoff's poem on the mystery of the incarnation. She writes, "It's when we face for a moment the worst our kind can do, and shudder to know the taint in our own selves, that awe cracks the mind's shell and enters the heart. Not to a flower, not to a dolphin, to no innocent form, but to this creature, vainly sure it and no other is God-like, God, out of compassion for our ugly failure to involve, entrusts as guest, as brother, the Word." I have to say that trust makes me humble, and it makes me hopeful that if maybe going on this journey with Jesus and the few who stood by his side can remind me that even when I feel so small compared to the forces around me, robbing even children of peace and life, even when I feel like all I can do is watch and pray and bear witness to the story and aid in burying the dead, that somehow my attention is part of the miracle that God is working to bring back to life what has died around me and within me. And that in continuing to be part of this story of resurrection, I can be changed too. Maybe looking on will eventually restore in me the hope that comes from the other side of the tomb, renewing me for the work of sharing the good news and fighting for the good, and being willing to put my own flesh in jeopardy to work toward the kingdom God has given us a glimpse of in Jesus, one made of justice, peace, mercy, and mutuality. I am going into this Holy Week with that hope, bringing the deepest questions of my heart before God and willingly opening myself to the most profound wisdom that is here among us and in our heritage, that at the heart of this story is wisdom for hope and for new life, and I invite you to do the same. Offer all these wonderings in the name of the God who created, who redeemed, and sustains us always. Amen.